It's a great joy to be here. I think I was here 2 years ago, or something like that, and that was in the midst of the Royal Commission, and now I come to you as one of them, either one of them being a commissioner or one of them being Catholic or one of them being something else. But I'm pleased that you're still on this journey. The journey about child sexual abuse started in the Catholic Church hundreds of years ago. The great myth of the Catholic Church was that it was a recent phenomenon. And yet the historical records of the Church show that it was a concern back in the early hundreds. It was certainly a concern within monasteries. It was a concern in the way in which private confession, which was not part of the tradition of the Church, started to develop. It was a concern within religious orders. It was a concern within the first few years of the early colony established in Australia, and it remained a concern to this day. For the nation, what we have seen is a national tragedy, a tragedy that's been played out in the lives of countless tens of thousands of children, now adults. For the Church itself, it is a great tragedy. It's a tragedy of epic proportions. Those who believed that this would be something small are beat up by media of those critics of the Church have been proven to be wrong. It saddens me that in the Church and the community at large, the problem is as large as we have discovered it to be. I wish it were otherwise. I wish that for the last 5 years I hadn't heard on every single day a criticism of this institution or that institution, many of which I've been associated. I wish that I haven't had to listen to the criticism of the Catholic Church, day in and day out, not only by victims, but by many others. But in a sense, that pain that's been gone through in the last 5 years for this institution and many others was one that was necessary. And if there is a word that comes to my mind in all of this, it's the word trust. Benedict XVI, when he was here in Sydney for the International Youth Day, used the term betrayal of trust in acknowledging the sexual abuse that took place within the Church. It also became the name of the report in Victorian parliamentary inquiry. And at the end of the day, it is at the very heart of what we've seen, a betrayal of trust. A betrayal of trust by individuals, by institutions, and ultimately by our society as a whole. For child sexual abuse isn't about an individual's actions. It is in fact about the way in which institutions both either allowed that to occur or responded. And more importantly, the endemic nature of the abuse we've seen is a societal issue. And the betrayal of trust, however, is a term that victims and survivors use all the time, and in particular in relation to religious institutions. The pain inflicted on those that were victims of abuse within faith-based institutions has a profoundly additional element, and that is the breach of trust in an organisation and an institution with which they should have been able to be safe. Of course, some will say to you, yes, but familial abuse is also a breach of trust of that family unit. It is also true that abuse within the community more generally is a breach of faith by the community as well. But it's undoubtedly true that in relation to faith-based institutions, this notion of trust, this breach of trust, plays out in the lives of victims and survivors, not only at the time that they were children, but throughout their lives. If I were to say to you 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, when I was at school or whatever it was, could I trust your organisation to keep the children safe? What would our institutions have said? What would the Mercies have said? The Josephites, the De La Salles, the Patricians, the Jesuits, the Christian Brothers, the Maras? They would have said, of course it's safe. And if 50 or 60 years ago I'd said to any of the provincial leaders of those organisations, or the CEOs of Catholic Care, whatever form it was at those days, if you found out about it, that you would take action, you would say, of course we would. And yet that was untrue. Today, if I say to you, any of the institutions in this room, is your institution safe for children? You will say to me the same answer. Yes, it is. If I said to you, if you became aware of abuses, would you act upon it? You would say, yes, I would. But why should I trust that answer? Why should the Australian people trust you? Why should it trust this institution or the institutions that have been subject to the Royal Commission? And the answer is you cannot ask that trust unless you can demonstrate it has in fact been is real. Your title about hearing, healing and hope, as you know, hearing is an inactive thing. It requires no effort at all. You simply hear the stories. On the sheets in front of you, you've seen a summary of the 8,000 private sessions that we've heard. And I won't go through those figures other than in broad terms. There's a chart on the front page of that will indicate to you why the Catholic Church stands out. 30% of those that we heard from complained about institutions that were state-run, 10% by non-government organisations that were non-faith-based, and 60% by faith-based institutions, institutions with whom I have been associated all of my life. And of course, within the faith-based institutions, nearly 60% of the institutions named were in fact Catholic. The question is not whether you've heard those voices. You couldn't but have heard them on television, on radio, in newspapers, unless you were in fact deliberately not listening. But the question is, have you listened to it? And listening is an engaged process where you actively try to discern, understand the words and the processes. It's that part that requires your response. So have we listened? Not just simply have we heard. And that's the challenge, I think, facing you and the Church at large, but also other institutions. If I can just in 15 minutes, or less now, I'm not going to summarise 5 years of work. And as for those of you that don't know, the final report is that large. All of our reports are that large. I have not counted the number of recommendations. The ABC told me it's 400. I haven't counted the number of pages, and I certainly don't know the number of words. You can do all of that. But I do want to make just a few very general comments, if I can, and then we're going to have Cherie, and then the whole purpose of this is to have an open discussion. The first thing for community services, your life will be affected by the recommendations that we have made. Just in one simple figure in that report, you'll see that 40% of those that came forward made complaints about organisations that run out-of-home care, whether it be the original orphanages or modern-day foster and kinship care. Community services were implicated right throughout the 5 years of the Royal Commission, whether they were faith-based or non-faith-based. And you'll know that the Royal Commission's report has a multi-layered approach to the recommendations. For you, the change in onus of proof, whereby you need to demonstrate that you've used reasonable endeavours to provide a child-safe environment, will become law throughout Australia and is already law in Victoria. There will be new criminal charges that will hold leaders within organisations accountable should they become aware of matters where a child is unsafe and they fail to report those matters to the police, or they fail to protect children, and some of those have been introduced into Victoria. There will be mandatory child safe regulations right throughout Australia, which will affect all institutions, including religious institutions in all of its forms. As Paul has already indicated, there will be changes to mandatory legislation that will require mandatory reporting by ministers of religion or those involved in religious ministries. And I could go through the number of regulatory changes that will impact on it. It will impact parishes and dioceses. It will impact health, community services, sporting groups and so on. And they are there for you to read. More significantly, however, is those that require cultural change within organisations, both your own and, in this case, the Church more at large. And again, it's not possible for me to go through the findings in relation to religious organisations in the Catholic Church, but I will make just a couple of broad statements. It is all very well for the Church to talk about voices and dialogue, but the Church must now accept the evidence. The Royal Commission, in an objective way, not in a way that was anti-Church or any other religion, has put before you and the Church and the other institutions the evidence And the conversations going forward towards the plenary of 2020 is not just about my views and your views. It's not just about the dialogue. It's actually about the evidence. And the evidence is that the church has been found wanting. It has been found wanting in many areas, both in terms of community services in the past and in our parishes and dioceses. As Marie has indicated, we probably didn't need a Royal Commission to know, but the evidence now is unquestionable, that clericalism is at the heart of a disease that has betrayed us as members of church and the community at large. There is a confluence of other factors in the Catholic Church that have contributed to the high level of abuse, significantly higher than was originally reported. Those factors do include contributing factors such as celibacy within the diocesan areas, the lack of poor selection, the inappropriate teaching of sexual and human development, the failure to have professional development and standards that guide all people involved in the activities of the church, the failure to consult effectively when leaders are appointed, both bishops and others, the lack of the feminine voice within the church, the lack of understanding of what governance is as distinct from what management is, and so on and so forth. These are not matters on which we can sit around and have a discussion. The evidence is clear. If you choose not to accept the evidence, then what are you left with? Not much. And one of the things we cannot go forward as a church and as community service organisations is simply what we think. Strangely enough, many of the laws that we've put in, one of them, the most important one, the reportable conduct regimes, which will affect your organisations if you're involved with children in the church at large, is designed to ensure that irrespective of who currently leads the organisations, there will be a constant oversight by the state, and that will go into the future. We haven't left to chance the notion of good people doing the right thing. To do that would be a foolish thing to have done given the history of what we've seen. So there are a number of regulations that, irrespective of who leads or who's involved in the organisations, will require an accountability to the state and to the community more generally. But within organisations such as the church, what will that level of accountability be? For the church, there's a fundamental issue at stake, or two, I suspect. The first, one that is often counted, is, are we going to be a church of the gospel or a church of the Roman Empire? So much is valued that has nothing to do with the gospel, but in fact was founded once Christianity became the formal religion of the Roman Empire. And we hold to those trappings as if they were God-given, and they were not. But more importantly, perhaps, is the second. Is this a church for whom some govern for others, or is it a church that will govern with us and with others? To move from a church that governs for us to move to a church that governs with us is critical. With the victims, with the survivors, with the laity, with the clergy, with the religious. And that is a challenge that will confront this church for decades to come. There are many recommendations that relate directly to the Catholic Church, and hopefully in the forum you'll ask me some questions about that. I can only say to you those recommendations have gone through the most rigorous process of understanding, of research, and if I can use the word, discernment. There are some that you would find curious as to why I would support them. There are some that when I started in the Royal Commission, I would not have thought I would have supported those. And there are others that you might in fact query why they were made at all. I can only say to you that the Royal Commission's final recommendations are based on the lived reality of victims and survivors. They are based on the evidence that was adduced in over 50 public hearings, of which 15 related to the Catholic Church. They are based on the evidence of over 100 pieces of research that were commissioned from many universities and other groups throughout Australia. They are based on an examination of international research and understanding and of reports that have been done right throughout the world. At the end of the day, I can simply say to you that I believe that the Royal Commission, on behalf of the people of Australia, have presented to you, to your organisations, to the Church and others both evidence and a rich resource of understanding that should be discerned as you try to respond. Lastly, in relation to keeping children safe, I want to acknowledge the fact that the Catholic social services are at the leading edge in many of these practices. When, in the final wrap-up, we actually had panels from the Health and Community Services area, that was not by chance. It was deliberately to try to look at the Church in its totalities, not just the diocese or the parishes. And what became very obvious to all of us and to all of those huge numbers that watched those hearings was that part of the Church does get it, does understand it, has gone through processes, have put in place standards, are committed to child safety, and are committed to ensure that where wrong does happen, there are consequences. It is true to say that on the other side of the aisle, the Church was seen to be vulnerable, that in many of its activities in parish and dioceses, that same level of rigour was not present, that same level of understanding of the issues, of deep listening, as Maria has indicated, was not present, and that many of the things that people thought would have happened are yet to happen. In a sense, it is a church with two aisles, like this room. On the one hand are you and many others who do get this issue and are prepared to make changes necessary. On the other is another group of people who are yet to fully understand what has just occurred and are going to struggle with many of the recommendations that have been made. But I'll say one thing that I have said before. It is the only institution that I have ever encountered where, within its own institution, it has the answers and yet refuses to, in fact, look to those answers, look to those solutions. It's a church where, on one side of the aisle, we have much to give the other, but there is little interchange or learning or understanding. I hope that changes. I'll conclude now and look forward to lots of questions as we go forward. But let me conclude with one thing, and that is, where is God in this? Perhaps, and many of you who have heard me speak, I often quote the prophet Micah, to act with justice, to love with tenderness, to walk humbly with your God. It is clear that in so many institutions, and the Catholic institutions, that when children needed love, they were met with hostility. There was simply no love present in their lives. When they returned to the church to seek justice, they were met with indifference, hostility, and unjust practices. And instead of a church walking humbly with its God, based on the messages of the gospel, it found an arrogant church, a church that's placed its own reputation above the interests of those victims and survivors, and did so knowingly and willingly in a way that would cause further harm to many of those victims. So today, each of us are charged with that. Can we create an institution and organisations that are ones that provide love, justice and humility, especially to victims and survivors of child sexual abuse? Thanks.